The red error messages pulsed across my screen like a siren. My fingers flew over the keys, patching the breach line by line. One more command, and the $510 million violation would be neutralized before it triggered across the global network. My breath was tight, my focus absolute. And then, the door slammed open. "Kara Sloan," Victor Harlan barked, his voice cutting like steel. "You're finished. Hand over your badge." It was 10:03 a.m. Every head in the operations floor turned toward me. My hands froze in midair above the keyboard, the final command untyped. I blinked at him, stunned, as two HR managers stepped forward like escorts at an execution. "You can't be serious," I whispered, my throat dry. But Harlan smirked, pulling a folder from under his arm. He slapped it onto my desk with theatrical force. "Signed and sealed. You're terminated immediately." Shock coursed through me, the humiliation sharper than any reprimand I'd endured in 20 years. I could feel my colleagues' eyes on me, some wide with pity, others with relief that it wasn't them. My face burned as though every ounce of my loyalty had been mocked in public. For 2 decades, I had been Argentum Capital's invisible safeguard. As the lead cybersecurity forensics analyst, I had stopped breaches no one else could see, built systems regulators trusted, and sacrificed countless nights so that global transfers worth billions could move without fear. My reward for 2 decades of vigilance was a public execution at my desk, in front of the very monitors that still flashed red with danger. And standing over me was Harland, everything I was not. He was flash, noise, charm for the board. Where I dealt in quiet precision, he thrived on reckless speed. To him, my systems were old paranoia, and I was a relic of dead code. The irony was cruel. In signing the termination notice with his bold, careless stroke of ink, he had unknowingly triggered the very clause he despised, the biometric safeguard that recognized only its original architect. The lock had been set years ago, invisible until now. At 10:03 a.m., Victor Harlan thought he had erased me. What he didn't know was that his own signature had just begun to erase him. I sat in the lobby with my badge deactivated, the humiliation still raw. My mind, however, drifted backward, tracing 2 decades of choices that had led me here. 20 years ago, I had been offered a lucrative job at a rival firm, double the salary, a corner office, the promise of recognition. I turned it down. I stayed at Argentum because I believed in something different. Security means loyalty. I told myself that protecting an institution was more than a paycheck. It was a calling. I sacrificed late nights, missed family milestones, and endless weekends in front of glowing monitors so that others could sleep knowing their money was safe. No headlines ever credited me. But I knew the truth. There were nights when an attack from overseas was hours from crippling our systems, and I was the one who quietly shut it down. There were mornings when regulators threatened to pull licenses until I produced data trails that reassured them. Twice, Argentum teetered on the edge of financial ruin, and twice, my invisible code stitched the seams before the cracks reached daylight. And yet, none of that mattered now. Victor Harland, the man who had just erased me with a signature, saw none of it. To him, I wasn't the safeguard who had kept billions flowing. I was an inconvenience. He had once called me a piece of outdated machinery in front of the board, smirking as if to prove that style mattered more than substance. He lived in press releases and quarterly numbers. I lived in the silent victories no one noticed. The bitterness stung deep. My pride, once quiet and steady, now felt bruised, as if those 20 years had been nothing more than wasted breaths. Was loyalty just another illusion companies dangled until they no longer needed you? The question burned at the edges of my chest. But underneath it all, a stubborn truth remained. I had built something Harland never understood. I remembered the day I designed the biometric window. It was after a near breach that almost cost Argentum $500 million in fines. I had proposed a system that would reset every 38 minutes, requiring the original architect's biometric signature to keep operations alive. The executives nodded politely, never bothering to read the technical clauses. They didn't realize the system was less about control and more about resilience, a failsafe ensuring no outsider, no imposter, could impersonate the person who created it. Most of my colleagues didn't even know it existed. Harlan certainly didn't. To him, security was a nuisance, a wall slowing his race toward short-term gains. But to me, the biometric window was more than code. It was a reflection of everything I believed in: loyalty, vigilance, accountability. As I sat there, discarded like scrap metal, that memory rose like a faint ember. My loyalty had been betrayed, my pride wounded, but my system, the one he mocked, was still alive, ticking quietly in the background. And if Harlan thought he had deleted me with a flourish of ink, he was about to discover that some code never disappears. The guard's hand was firm on my elbow as he escorted me through the glass doors. It was 10:07 a.m. Less than 5 minutes had passed since Victor Harlan's declaration. But it felt like an entire lifetime compressed into humiliation. My badge was already useless. The tiny strip of plastic that had once opened every secure level of Argentum, now just a dead weight in my palm. The floor had gone silent as I walked past. I could feel eyes following me, some wide with shock, others carefully blank. But a few carried that unmistakable mix of pity and relief. Relief that it wasn't them. Pity that it was me. For years I had been the ghost in the machine. The one they called at 2 in the morning when a breach threatened to spiral out of control. Now I was nothing but a cautionary tale, paraded out like a criminal. The sting wasn't just in the stares. It was in the memories that clung to every hallway I passed. Here was the server room where I had once stopped a foreign attack, seconds before regulators discovered it. There. The conference wing where I sat quietly, while executives boasted of seamless transactions, never mentioning the silent analyst who had made it possible. I had filled these spaces with my life. And now, with every step, the walls themselves seemed to push me out. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, desperate for something familiar, something human. The screen lit up with a photo. My 2 children, smiling on a campus lawn in the fall, books in hand, both in college now, their tuition paid by the years I spent inside this building. That picture was more than pixels. It was a reminder of why I had stayed late, why I had accepted the endless overtime, why I had silenced my own exhaustion. The hurt cut deeper. I had sacrificed birthday dinners, anniversaries, and the small, ordinary joys of being present. I had traded them for screens filled with error codes, red alerts, and the constant drumbeat of responsibility. And for what? To be dragged out like this, my loyalty erased in less than a minute. Outside, the autumn air slapped against my face. Loneliness pressed in, heavy and undeniable. The hum of the city continued as though nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. My chest tightened with the cruel realization. I had given Argentum my life, and in return, it had discarded me without a second thought. That was the twist, the bitter truth that settled in my bones as I stood on the sidewalk. I hadn't just lost a job. I had gambled away my personal life, my memories, my family moments, all in service of a company that could erase me with a single stroke of a pen. 1 minute of arrogance had undone 20 years of devotion. And in that loneliness, I felt the sharpest hurt of all. Inside the top-floor boardroom, Victor Harland paced like a showman on stage. The news of my termination hadn't even cooled before he seized the chance to frame it as a triumph. "I've cleaned out the dead weight," he declared, his voice booming against the glass walls. "We can finally run lean, no more clunky. Outdated processes slowing us down. Argentum is free to move at the speed of the market now. The board members, some skeptical, others eager to stay in his good graces, nodded politely. Harlan thrived on that nodding, on the illusion that his recklessness was innovation, down in the operations pit. However, reality was already fraying. Miles Donovan, one of the youngest IT analysts, leaned toward his supervisor with a pale face. Sir, the system's logging abnormal errors since Sloan was removed. They're multiplying. I think. The supervisor glanced nervously toward the boardroom windows and cut him off. Keep quiet. Harlan doesn't want noise right now. But Miles couldn't ignore the numbers flashing across his monitor. Code fragments were misfiring. Authentication attempts were bouncing back into error loops. It was subtle, but growing. He pushed his chair back, swallowed hard, and tried again, this time sending a message directly to Harlan's inbox. Minutes later, Harlan skimmed the alert on his phone. His lips curled into a smirk. He strode back to the table, raising the device like a prop. One of the kids downstairs thinks the sky is falling. Error logs, glitches. You know what I call that? Static. Noise from a system that's been too dependent on one person for too long. Exactly why I cut her loose. He tossed the phone down and spread his arms as if daring the room to challenge him. No one did. From across the street, I could see the reflection of the boardroom in the glass. Harlan's gestures magnified like a performance. My fists clenched in my coat pockets. Quiet rage coiled inside me. Not from surprise, but from recognition. This was who he was. A man who mistook arrogance for leadership, who would rather bury a truth than confront it. Miles sat frozen at his desk, the only one brave enough to notice, yet powerless to stop the show upstairs. His jaw tightened. Then, in a decision that would matter later, he slipped a drive from his pocket and began copying the logs. Every error line, every timestamp tied to the moment of my removal. Saved. Encrypted. Undeniable. Harlan kept boasting, blind to the cracks spreading beneath his feet, and I stood outside, quiet fury burning, knowing arrogance always collapses under its own weight. At 10:19 a.m., the first fracture appeared. Tokyo flagged a critical transfer, refusing to release funds without biometric verification. On the trading floor, screens flickered yellow with the word pending. Nervous voices rose, operators scrambling to reroute. By 10:24 a.m., Frankfurt froze a $400 million tranche midstream. Traders cursed, managers barked orders, but nothing moved. The numbers on their monitors hung in limbo. Like breath caught in a throat, the air grew thick with unease, whispers echoing across cubicles. Employees glanced toward the glass boardroom above, as if expecting leadership to descend with answers. Instead, Victor Harlan remained in his role as performer. He swept into the operations floor, voice booming with forced confidence. Calm down, people. It's temporary lag. International lines get messy. It'll clear in minutes. He smiled as though he could will the crisis away. His tailored suit crisp, his tone rehearsed. Denial radiated off him like cologne. A few managers nodded, clinging to his words because they had nothing else. But beneath the surface, suspense gnawed. The logs Miles Donovan had flagged earlier were multiplying. Error loops, failed authentications, biometric queries echoing unanswered. Miles tried again to raise his hand, but Harlan shot him a glare sharp enough to slice. No fear-mongering, Harlan snapped. This is why we move forward without relics holding us back. The system is fine. Fine. That word rang hollow against the tension of stalled billions. Traders tapped pens restlessly. Analysts refreshed screens, as if repetition might change the outcome. Every minute without resolution felt like a lifetime, the suspense crawling under their skin. And outside the tower, I felt it too. Though I no longer had access, My instincts told me the cycle was ticking toward disaster. Each delay was not a glitch, it was a symptom, a countdown no one inside could see, because the only eyes trained to recognize it had been erased at 10:03 a.m. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I glanced down, expecting a message from my kids or a colleague offering quiet sympathy. Instead, the name froze me. Eleanor Briggs, a senior regulator with the International Securities Commission, a woman who had once told me, after a near-miss crisis, "You're the reason we trust Argentum's numbers." I hesitated before answering. "Kara!" Her voice came through, sharp and urgent. "Why hasn't your biometric shown up on the system today? Tokyo and Frankfurt are stalling. We need your confirmation, or we'll have no choice but to escalate." My breath caught. Suspense twisted into something colder. Eleanor didn't know. She thought I was still inside, still authorized, still holding the system together. And in that moment, the truth cut deep. I had been erased from Argentum, but the world still depended on me. At 10:33 a.m., Toronto became the third domino. The regulators there flatly refused to clear Argentum's order, citing one reason that sent ripples of dread through the operations floor: missing biometric confirmation. The words appeared across monitors like a death sentence. Traders cursed under their breath. Managers leaned over consoles, demanding explanations no one could give. It was no longer just Tokyo or Frankfurt. It was spreading west. And with it came the terrifying sense that billions of dollars were drifting into quicksand. For a moment, the floor buzzed with speculation. Then Harlan stormed down from the boardroom, face red with indignation, jaw tight. He cut through the rows of desks, exuding fury, barely restrained. "Out of my way!" he barked, shoving a junior aside to reach the command console. "If Sloan could run this, so can I. It's my company, my system now." The staff fell silent, all eyes glued to the screen as Harland rolled up his sleeves. He typed with exaggerated confidence, forcing override commands into the system. His smirk returned briefly, as though sheer arrogance could bend the code to his will. Then the console blinked. A line of text burned across the monitor in stark white letters. "Authorization denied. Original architect signature required." The silence was deafening. Harlan's face contorted, disbelief giving way to rage. He slammed a fist against the desk so hard the keyboard rattled. "This is garbage! Sloan rigged it to make herself indispensable!" he shouted, his voice cracking through the floor. "Find me another way in! Anything!" But the truth was already hanging in the air. The system didn't trust him, didn't care about his title, didn't recognize his authority. It only answered to one fingerprint, one iris scan, one name, mine, from across the street. I imagined the chaos as clearly as if I were still there. My humiliation had not vanished, but for the first time since 10:03 a.m., a flicker of vindication stirred inside me. I had warned them. I had told them security wasn't about convenience, but they had mocked me as obsolete. Now, the very lock they dismissed was the one holding billions hostage. Amid the storm, one figure kept his head low. Miles Donovan. He had watched Harlan's tantrum in silence, his own screen displaying the same denial message. His fingers trembled as he hit a few keys. With quick precision, he captured a screenshot, time-stamped, unalterable proof that the system required me. He slipped the file onto a secure drive and, after a pause, sent it to my personal phone. My device buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down. The image filled my screen. The error message. The command line. The phrase only I had embedded years ago. For the first time that morning, I smiled faintly. Someone inside still saw the truth. The first calls from investors hit at 10:35 a.m. By the second minute, they were flooding in, phones vibrating across every desk in the upper tower. Traders clutched receivers, their voices pitched high, trying to explain why billions in transactions were hanging unresolved. Words like unacceptable and breach of trust echoed from every direction. In the boardroom, the atmosphere turned feverish. Executives filed in, faces pale, ties loosened, while Harlan tried to hold the center like a storm anchor. His voice, though raised, betrayed a strain that hadn't been there earlier. "We're under attack," he insisted, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Hackers are probing the system. This isn't structural, it's external interference." The board exchanged uneasy looks. They had heard him boast only an hour ago about streamlining operations, about cutting old code. Now billions were stuck, regulators were calling, and the only explanation Harlan could summon was faceless hackers. Suspicion hung heavy. A senior board member leaned forward. Victor, Tokyo, Frankfurt, and now Toronto are all flagging the same missing biometric. How would hackers erase a compliance signature? Harlan waved it off with a dismissive gesture. They spoof logs, flood systems with false errors. It's basic cyber warfare. But his voice cracked on the last word, and the room felt it. The denial was beginning to buckle under pressure. Meanwhile, chaos outside the boardroom swelled. On the operations floor, staff rushed between stations. Regulators held on the line demanding answers, and the buzz of unanswered questions rose like static. Every unanswered call stacked weight on the already trembling tower of confidence. Argentum wasn't just faltering. It was beginning to collapse under its own arrogance. Then came the mistake. One board secretary, flustered by the torrent of emails, attempted to forward a sanitized report to the International Securities Commission, but instead of attaching Harlan's scripted talking points, he forwarded the wrong document. The signed termination notice bearing Harlan's bold ink. The very paper that confirmed Argentum had fired its only authorized biometric architect at 10:03 a.m. The silence in the boardroom was suffocating when the error was discovered. Harlan lunged toward the secretary, demanding it be recalled. But the damage was already done. Regulators now had proof that the chaos was not foreign sabotage, but a wound Argentum had inflicted on itself. At 10:39 a.m., my phone buzzed again. It was Eleanor Briggs. Her voice was steady, though I could sense the sharp satisfaction underneath. "Kara, we just received Harlan's termination order. He signed you out during an active violation cycle. That alone explains every freeze we're seeing." She paused, letting the weight of it settle. Argentum didn't fall to hackers. It fell to its own negligence. And now we have the evidence. I stood there on the sidewalk, coat drawn tight against the autumn wind, listening to her words echo like a verdict, inside those glass walls. Harlan's empire was unraveling, undone not by enemies at the gates, but by his own signature. The chaos had peaked, the pressure had no release, and the truth had finally stepped into the light. At 10:41 a.m., the floor fell out from under Argentum Capital. In one shattering instant, the systems across the globe synchronized in failure. 21 nations, every major hub where Argentum held contracts, issued the same declaration. All transactions suspended pending biometric verification. On the operations floor, monitors exploded into red. The words scrolled in unison, cold and unrelenting. Suspended, biometric missing. The sight was apocalyptic. Dozens of screens flickering the same message. Traders frozen in disbelief. Analysts gripping their desks as if the world had tilted. Phones rang without pause, the shrill sound cutting through the rising panic. Some answered with trembling hands, their voices cracking as they tried to explain the unexplainable. Others simply stared, pale and silent, knowing there was no script for this moment. Fear moved like a contagion. It wasn't just one office, or one city, or one transaction. This was global paralysis, billions locked in limbo, trust evaporating in real time. The collective weight of it pressed against every chest in that tower, suffocating, undeniable. Upstairs, Harlan slammed his fists on the boardroom table. It's temporary. It's pressure from competitors. A coordinated smear. His voice rose to a near shout, but it no longer carried authority. It carried desperation. The board members leaned away from him, their eyes on the red screens beyond the glass. The image was too stark to ignore. For the staff who had believed his reassurances minutes earlier, the collapse was total. Their denial evaporated into dread. Some whispered about severance packages. Others wondered aloud if regulators would shut Argentum down completely. The company that had once prided itself on being untouchable was unraveling in plain sight. And then the news broke. By 10:45 a.m., international outlets were running the headline across tickers and broadcasts. The Harlan freeze, $2. 5 billion locked in 21 nations. The name spread instantly, attaching itself like a brand scar. Employees stared at their phones as push notifications buzzed. The CEO's name etched forever into financial history, not as a visionary, but as the man who presided over the freeze. The weight of it hit harder than the red screens. It wasn't just collapse. It was humiliation made global. From across the street, I watched the tower through its mirrored glass facade. Though I couldn't hear the panic inside, I didn't need to. The reflection told the story, figures rushing, hands flailing, a once confident empire trembling under its own arrogance. The collective fear was complete. The collapse was no longer impending. It had arrived. The autumn air felt sharper now, cool against my skin as I stood across the street. Argentum's tower loomed above me, all glass and steel. Yet what I saw wasn't grandeur. It was chaos, reflected back through its own polished facade. Behind those panes, shadows moved in frantic bursts, executives rushing, hands gesturing wildly, assistants darting between rooms with stacks of papers they couldn't possibly explain. The mirrored windows blurred their panic into streaks of motion, like ants swarming after their hill had been cracked open. I didn't need to hear the noise inside. The reflection alone told the story. For the first time all morning, I felt still. I pulled my coat tighter, exhaling into the chill. The humiliation of 10:03 a.m. was still a bruise under my ribs. But standing here now, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't the one trapped in those rooms, shouting excuses into a void. That burden was theirs. My silence, my distance, was its own kind of power. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I half expected it to be one of my kids, maybe worried after hearing news bulletins about Argentum's freeze. Instead, the name glowing on the screen made me pause. Eleanor Briggs. Her message was short, but every word carried weight. The regulators stand with you. I read it twice, letting the quiet dignity of the words sink in. For years, I had fought to prove that security mattered more than speed, that resilience meant more than a quarterly headline. They had called me old-fashioned, paranoid, a relic. Yet here was proof from the very people who mattered most that my work had been the backbone regulators trusted, even stripped of my badge. I hadn't been erased. My principles had outlasted the arrogance that dismissed them. I lifted my eyes again to the glass tower. In its reflection, I no longer saw myself as the discarded analyst walking away in disgrace. I saw a woman who had given 2 decades of loyalty, and though betrayed, still stood intact. Calm settled into my chest, not triumphant, not vengeful, just steady. A release I hadn't known I needed. Then, another buzz. This time, an email notification. I unlocked the screen, scanning the subject line, "We'd like to meet." The sender, a rival technology firm whose name I knew well, one that had built its reputation on longevity rather than flash. I opened it quickly. We value architects who build systems that last. If you're free this week, we'd like to discuss opportunities. For a moment, I simply stared, the words blurring slightly as the weight of them settled. While Harland fought for survival inside his glass cage, I was already being seen for what I had always been: not expendable, not obsolete, but essential. I slid the phone back into my coat pocket, the corner of my mouth lifting in the faintest smile. Argentum could keep its panic. I had found something better: dignity no one could take, and a future no one could erase. Inside Argentum's glass tower, the downfall had reached its crescendo. Victor Harlan's voice thundered through the boardroom, no longer polished or commanding, but ragged with desperation. "You can't do this to me! I'm Argentum!" His fists slammed the table, papers scattering like fallen leaves. But the faces surrounding him had shifted. The same board members who once applauded his bravado now leaned back in silence, their expressions flat, their loyalty evaporated. One by one, eyes turned away from him. His empire of charm had dissolved, and only his rage remained. The shouting carried beyond the glass, audible even to staff in the operations floor below. Each yell was another crack in his authority. They knew it was over. The man who once strutted through the office with absolute confidence was now begging shadows not to abandon him. And they were, while Harlan collapsed in fury upstairs. I stood outside on the opposite curb, the autumn wind pressing gently against me. For the first time in 2 decades, the weight on my shoulders felt lighter. I had walked into this day believing loyalty meant security. I was leaving it with the realization that true security came from myself. There was no badge in my pocket, no office waiting, no title attached to my name. And yet, I felt freer than I had in years. I thought of the email still glowing on my phone. "We value architects who build systems that last." A rival firm wanted to meet, not because I was loud or fashionable, but because my work had endured, because what I had built still mattered. For a moment, I imagined stepping back inside Argentum, confronting Harland face to face, watching his arrogance crumble with my own words. Revenge whispered to me, tempting, sharp. But then I thought of my children, of the nights I had traded for blinking screens, of the cost of letting anger chain me any longer. No, I would not waste one more second on him. Instead, I would take that meeting. I would use my experience to protect employees like me, the quiet ones who carried entire systems on their backs, the ones leaders thought they could erase without consequence. If I could prevent even one person from being discarded as I had been, then the years would not have been wasted. I took a final glance at the tower, now reflecting nothing but panic. My lips curved into the faintest smile as I whispered to myself, at 10:03 a.m., he erased me. At 10:41 a.m., the world erased him, and I chose not revenge, but freedom. The wind carried the words away, leaving me lighter. Sometimes the greatest justice isn't revenge, but choosing your own freedom. Kara's story is proof that dignity cannot be deleted, and loyalty, real loyalty, always finds its place. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of justice, redemption, and the victories that come when silence finally speaks.